Chapter 21. Awakening the Darkness. The town of Crestwood had always held a certain charm, a postcard-perfect image of Americana nestled in the heartland. Quaint, manicured, and utterly forgettable until tonight. Tonight, that charm had curdled, replaced by a palpable sense of dread that hung heavy in the air, thick as a shroud. The moon, usually a comforting presence, hid its face behind a veil of storm clouds, leaving the streets to the mercy of flickering streetlights that cast long, distorted shadows, dancing like ghouls on cracked asphalt. The air, typically sweet with the scent of pine and damp earth, now carried a faint, metallic tang, a precursor to the blood that would soon soak the soil. Deep within the research facility, a malevolent entity stirred. He was a silent symphony of scales and sinew, unlike anything Crestwood had ever witnessed, a nightmare made flesh. The facility itself, a sprawling concrete maze on the town's forgotten edge, hummed with a deathly silence, its sterile halls now a tomb. Vargoth, as he had been coldly designated in the facility's records, was not merely a creature. He was a precision instrument of terror. He moved with a predatory grace that belied his monstrous form, a fluidity that spoke of ancient, primordial hunters. His scales, a sleek dark blue, shimmered in the few slivers of dim light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, highlighting the lethal contours of his theropod body. A pale blue eye, intelligent and utterly devoid of compassion, burned with a cold fire, reflecting the barren landscapes of a soul long lost. Vargoth was the name whispered in the shadows, the bringer of eternal night, a harbinger of an age where human screams would be the only liturgy. Vargoth savored the fear that permeated the town, a delectable appetizer before the main course. It was a potent, heady aroma, a blend of primal terror and civilized panic, intoxicating to his honed senses. He felt the pulse of the town's energy, the fragile lives he was about to extinguish, each beat a tantalizing promise of chaos. He was a predator, a hunter of souls and flesh, and Crestwood, in its unwitting ignorance, was merely his designated hunting ground. He moved with unnerving speed, a dark blur against the decaying backdrop of the facility, his every step a silent declaration of war. He relished the thought of the chaos he was about to unleash, the screams he would orchestrate into a macabre symphony, the despair he would feed upon like a succulent feast. He left the facility without any trace, a phantom slipping through concrete and steel, his presence unnoticed by the few remaining souls brave enough to venture out into the night. His exit was not an escape, but a deliberate release, the unlatching of a cage door he himself had chosen to open. Then darkness fell. It wasn't a gradual fading, a gentle descent into dusk, but an abrupt, violent plunge. The streetlights sputtered and died, one after another, like candles snuffed by an unseen hand, plunging Crestwood into absolute blackness. The power grid, strained by years of neglect and now buckling under the insidious weight of Vargoth's influence, had finally given way. The abrupt silence that followed was deafening, a thick, suffocating blanket, broken only by the rising wind that whispered through the power lines and the frantic cries of startled wildlife. A shiver, colder than the late autumn air, snaked through the town. Panic, a wildfire of the mind, began to spread. People stumbled through their homes, their hands scrambling in the sudden void, fumbling for flashlights and candles. The faint glow of cell phone screens became isolated beacons in the encroaching abyss, quickly losing their signal. Car alarms blared intermittently, their shrill cries a sharp, discordant accompaniment to the growing cacophony of fear. Whispers turned to shouts, and shouts soon swelled into raw, unadulterated screams as the true horrifying extent of the disaster became clear. But the power outage was only the beginning. Vargoth's true horror was only now beginning to unfold. Those he had touched, those he had violated and infected with the VSS, virulent shadow strain virus, were undergoing horrific transformations. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and something else, something acrid and unnatural. The dead rose, their bodies contorted into grotesque parodies of their former selves, limbs snapping and reforming with sickening cracks as they became something else entirely. Their eyes, once human, now glowed with a feral predatory light, driven by an insatiable hunger. Skin stretched taut over newly hardened bone, claws tore through fingernails, and teeth elongated into needle-sharp fangs. The infected twisted and writhed on the ground, their minds consumed by a ravenous, all-encompassing hunger. Their bodies morphing into creatures resembling Vargoth, but smaller, weaker, more primal. Their dark blue scales were duller, their movements jerky, lacking the antagonist's terrifying grace. They were reflections in a shattered mirror, fragments of a greater terror, driven only by instinct, their guttural snarls already echoing through the deepening gloom. And the women he had defiled suffered an even more gruesome fate, a horror so profound it transcended mere physical pain. Their bodies, once vessels of life and warmth, were now incubators for his vile offspring. They perished in agony, their cries echoing through empty rooms, their wounds birthing smaller, twisted versions of Vargoth himself, emerging from torn flesh and shattered bone. These newborns, miniatures of their monstrous father, were born with an immediate, ravenous hunger, their pale blue eyes already burning with a cold, inherited malice. Their mother's last breaths were choked by the monstrous births, their final moments an unspeakable torment. The town became a feeding ground, a battleground between the living and the newly undead. The smaller creatures, born of the VSS strain, driven by a primal, insatiable hunger, rampaged through the streets, tearing at anything that moved. The sounds of their guttural snarls and the screams of their victims echoed through the absolute darkness, painting an auditory landscape of pure terror. The air grew heavy with the tang of blood, the metallic scent mixing with the acrid smell of fear and burning ozone. Meanwhile, Vargoth, the architect of this nightmare, moved with purpose. He felt drawn not to a place of power, but to a place of faith, of hope, a place that represented everything he despised, a small church on the outskirts of town. He could sense the fear radiating from within, the desperate prayers offered up to a silent God, a delicious contrast to the chaos he had unleashed. Inside the church, a fragile island against the encroaching tide of darkness, Emily and Jake huddled together. The flickering golden light of a single candle fought valiantly against the oppressive gloom, illuminating their ashen faces. Emily clutched a worn Jake to her chest, her lips moving in silent, desperate prayer, the words a frantic flutter against the rising storm outside. Her body trembled beside Jake, her eyes wide with terror, reflecting the dancing flame. Jake, despite the tremor in his own hands, tried to maintain a semblance of calm, his hand resting reassuringly on Emily's shoulder, a futile gesture against an unseen enemy. They had sought refuge in the ancient building, hoping that its sanctity, its hallowed ground, would protect them from the horrors that stalked the streets. They had prayed for deliverance, for a miracle, for any sign that God had not abandoned Crestwood. Outside, the fragile silence of their sanctuary was shattered by a guttural roar that ripped through the trees, raw and primal, sending birds scattering into the bruised twilight sky. It was a sound that resonated deep within their bones, a primal scream of rage and possession, a sound they knew belonged to the architect of this night. Vargoth, driven by a fury that vibrated like a storm on the horizon, had sensed their intrusion, their defiance. He was barreling back toward the graveyard surrounding the church, a force of nature unleashed, ready to unleash his monstrous wrath. The ground trembled beneath his weight as he tore through the undergrowth, leaving a trail of splintered trees and churned earth in his wake. "He's coming!" Zoe screamed, scrambling back from the church's entrance, her voice ragged with terror. She had been trying to barricade the door, but the sound had made her freeze. Outside, Preacher Francis felt the rumble beneath his feet, a tremor that shook the very foundations of the old church. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the impending doom. He knew with chilling certainty that the creature was returning, drawn by the last vestiges of hope and faith within these walls. He gripped the ancient shepherd's crook he carried, the wood worn smooth by generations of Hashimoto's, each groove a testament to countless hands seeking comfort and strength. This instrument of peace, a symbol of guidance and solace, would have to become his weapon in the face of this unholy malevolence. Anna, her face a mask of frantic desperation, pulled Emily to her feet. "We can't stay here. He'll be here any moment, Emily. We have to go." But Emily, her eyes blazing with a fierce, almost defiant determination, refused to move. "I'm not leaving him. Not again." She was looking at Jake, her heart wrenching at how weak he was, his breath shallow, his body racked with tremors. All she wanted to do was protect him, to shield him from the encroaching darkness, just like she should have done before he was taken away. A memory that now twisted in her gut, a burning coal of regret. "Emily, there's nothing we can do for him here," Anna desperately cried, tugging harder at Emily's arm, her voice strained. There wasn't enough time for this agonizing debate. The growling intensified, closer now, echoing through the cavernous church and the hallways above their heads. "We have to go, Emily. He's right above us," Zoe cried, her voice a desperate plea. "No," Emily shouted, her voice thick with anguish and resolve. "I won't leave him any more." She kneeled down once more, ignoring the escalating terror, and with a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, heaved Jake's arm over her shoulders, struggling to lift his dead weight. Anna and Zoe, knowing that arguing further was useless, their faces grim with the knowledge of their impending doom. They weren't building a trap for Vargoth. Not really. They were building a desperate delaying tactic for the smaller creatures, a flimsy hope for escape. They overturned pews, stacking them haphazardly, tearing down heavy cloths to create crude temporary barriers, anything to buy them precious seconds. The growling was now directly behind them, vibrating through the very stones of the church, getting closer, closer. Emily knew that the creature would be upon them any second. The memory of abandoning him before, of prioritizing her own fear over his safety, burned in her soul, a scar that had never truly healed. She wouldn't run away, not this time. She would face this horror, whatever the cost. This was it, she knew. And then she didn't know anymore. Her world narrowed to Jake's gasping breath, the scent of dust and fear, and the deafening roar that swallowed everything else. Back at the heart of Crestwood, the dream of a cure had crumbled into dust. The virus, once contained within the sterile walls of the research facility, had breached its confines and was now raging unchecked through the town. The hope of salvation, of finding an antidote, had been replaced by the grim reality of an impending apocalypse. The first line of defense, a SWAT team dispatched to contain the escalating chaos, found themselves facing an enemy far more formidable than they had ever imagined. Their training, their weapons, their tactical prowess were all woefully inadequate against the sheer, unbridled ferocity of the transformed. In the echoing halls of the Crestwood Science Museum, a sprawling modern edifice of glass and steel, now shattered and mangled, they battled the transformed. Their bullets ripped through flesh and bone, blowing apart grotesque limbs and tearing through scaly hides, but doing little to stop the relentless onslaught. The smaller Vargoth-like monsters, their pale blue eyes burning with an unholy hunger, just kept coming, driven by an inhuman ferocity, their guttural snarls a constant terrifying chorus. The air was thick with gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, and the acrid stench of something chemically unnatural. One particularly large specimen, a hulking brute with razor-sharp claws and teeth that protruded like obsidian daggers, proved especially difficult to subdue. It moved with a terrifying speed, a whirlwind of muscle and malice, tearing through the team's formation, its roars vibrating through the steel girders of the museum. After a brutal, protracted fight, a desperate ballet of survival, the SWAT team managed to corner it in the museum's grand atrium, its back against a collapsing display of ancient fossils. With a desperate burst of concentrated gunfire, their rifles spitting fire and lead, they managed to bring the creature down, but not before it unleashed a final agonizing roar that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The creature writhed on the marble floor, its massive body convulsing, blood pooling beneath its dark blue scales. In a last desperate act of survival, its instincts screaming at it to escape, it attempted to flee, clawing its way towards a gaping hole in the museum wall, a ragged wound in the building's facade. But the team, their faces drawn and grim, opened fire again, a concentrated barrage. One well-placed bullet, a stray spark in the chaos, ignited a flammable gas that had slowly been leaking from a damaged exhibit, all over the creature. It burst into an inferno, a screeching, burning effigy of terror. The creature released a final, ear-splitting shriek as it crashed down, its immense weight shattering through the already weakened floor of the museum, where it fell into the science lab below. The fall killed it upon impact, but not before dragging some of the soldiers, caught in the inferno and the collapse, down into the fiery abyss with it. The explosion rocked the museum, sending shockwaves through the entire town, a final definitive punctuation mark to the night's horrors. Glass showered down, concrete cracked, and the remaining structure groaned in protest. The hope that had flickered briefly in the face of the darkness, the faint, desperate belief that somehow, someone could stop this, was extinguished, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of their situation. Crestwood was almost lost. The darkness had already awakened,